This realization changed the tone of the entire project. What began as a quiet interview about old-fashioned food became something closer to an act of preservation itself, a race against time to capture details that existed nowhere else in the world. The crew began asking increasingly specific questions, hoping to extract as much as possible before it was too late. How exactly did her mother judge when cream was ready to churn? What specific signs told her family the corn was dry enough for the crib? Which plants, gathered from which exact hillside, made the best wild tonic during early spring sickness? Opal answered patiently, though sometimes she would stop mid-sentence, her eyes drifting toward the window, as if she were watching the memory happen again somewhere just beyond the glass. It was during one of these pauses that Opal finally returned, unprompted, to the dish she had refused to explain earlier. She said her grandmother made it using nothing fancy, just dried beans, a small portion of preserved meat, and herbs gathered specifically from the edge of the family cemetery. The location of the herbs was not accidental. It was intentional, symbolic, meant to connect the living directly to the dead through the simple act of eating. She said the dish tasted bitter, intentionally so, because grief was not meant to be masked with sweetness. It was meant to be tasted fully, then swallowed, then carried forward. Opal said she had not eaten that dish since her grandmother's funeral, decades earlier, because there was no one left who understood why it mattered, and a ritual without shared understanding becomes, in her words, just food. The crew sat in silence after she said this. It was one of those rare, unscripted moments where a documentary stops feeling like a documentary and starts feeling like something closer to a confession. Opal was not just preserving facts about old recipes. She was protecting the emotional architecture behind them, the invisible scaffolding that gave ordinary ingredients extraordinary meaning. Once she explained it aloud on camera, something shifted. It was as if she had finally set down a weight she had been carrying alone for most of her life. A weight made not of grief itself, but of the responsibility to remember grief correctly. As filming continued into the following days, the documentary crew began to notice something else entirely. Opal's memories were not simply nostalgic. They were instructive, almost scientific in their precision, even though she had never used a thermometer or a written measurement in her life. She could describe exact textures that indicated proper fermentation. She could describe the precise sound a cellar door made when humidity levels were correct for storing root vegetables through winter. Modern food science, with all its instruments and laboratories, was only now beginning to rediscover principles that women like Opal had carried intuitively for generations. Refined through repeated failure and careful observation, passed quietly from mother to daughter. This created a strange and powerful irony at the heart of the documentary. The very technology that had replaced women like Opal, refrigeration, food science, industrial preservation, was now scrambling to recover the wisdom those advancements had originally made obsolete. Researchers had begun studying traditional fermentation methods, traditional curing techniques, traditional preservation timing, hoping to recover flavors and nutritional benefits lost during decades of industrialization. And yet here was Opal, the literal embodiment of that knowledge, sitting quietly in a hollow that few people outside her community even knew existed, waiting for someone to simply ask. Opal eventually spoke about loneliness, though not in the way people usually expect. She said the loneliest part of growing old was not the absence of people, since her family visited regularly and loved her deeply. It was the absence of anyone who could fully understand the world she remembered. Her children and grandchildren listened politely to her stories, but they had never tasted what she tasted, never smelled what she smelled, never felt the particular tension of waiting through a long winter wondering if the preserved food would hold until spring. They loved her, but they could not meet her there, in that specific sensory world, because that world simply no longer existed for them to step into. This loneliness, Opal explained, was different from ordinary sadness. It was the loneliness of being a living artifact, a final fragment of something larger that had once connected entire communities through shared labor and shared survival. She said she sometimes dreamed about her mother's kitchen so vividly that she could smell the wood smoke upon waking, only to open her eyes to the quiet hum of her own refrigerator in the next room. A sound, she said, she had never fully gotten used to, even after living with it for most of her adult life. Toward the final days of filming, the crew asked Opal what she hoped people would understand from her story. She thought for a long moment before answering. She said she did not want anyone to feel guilty about modern conveniences, since survival looks different in every generation, and no one should be expected to live exactly as their ancestors did. What she wanted instead was simpler. She wanted people to understand that something real had been lost, even if it could not be measured in nutrients or convenience. She wanted them to understand that flavor, real flavor, was once inseparable from time, from labor, from community, and from love expressed through patience rather than words. She said one final thing that the filmmaker chose to end the documentary with, a sentence delivered so quietly that the sound team had to adjust the levels afterward just to make sure it was captured clearly. She said that someday the last jar of true homemade preserves would be opened somewhere in the world, and no one would know it was the last. There would be no ceremony, no announcement, no moment of recognition. The world would simply move forward, the way it always does, without realizing exactly what had quietly ended. Not long after the documentary was completed, Opal passed away peacefully in the same hollow where she had been born nearly a century earlier. Her family said she spent her final weeks unusually at peace, often sitting by the window, watching the tree line the way she had during filming, as if some part of her had already begun returning to the world she remembered most clearly. At her funeral, one of her granddaughters attempted to recreate a version of the bitter herb dish, using whatever she could find, hoping to honor a tradition she had only recently learned existed. Everyone agreed it did not taste quite right. But for a few quiet minutes, gathered together at a single table, they understood, just barely, what Opal had been trying to tell them all along. The documentary crew kept hours of unused footage, recordings filled with small details that never made the final cut, fragments of forgotten knowledge that may never be fully understood by anyone again. Somewhere in those recordings, Opal describes the exact sound cream makes the moment it turns to butter, a sound she said you simply cannot find anywhere else in the modern world. It is a small detail, easy to overlook, yet it captures everything her life represented. A world built on attention, a world built on patience, a world where flavor was never separate from love and where love was never separate from time. Opal was the last person who carried that world fully within her, not as information, but as lived experience. And when she said that nothing tastes the same anymore because nothing is the same anymore, she was not simply talking about food. She was talking about everything that food used to hold together, quietly, patiently, one generation at a time, until there was no one left who remembered how. There is a taste that no longer exists anywhere on earth, and only one woman alive still remembered exactly what it was. She was 96 years old when a young filmmaker found her, sitting on a porch in the Appalachian foothills, her hands folded over a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. She did not smile when the camera turned on. She simply looked into the lens and said one sentence that the filmmaker would never forget. "Nothing tastes the same anymore," she said, "because nothing is the same anymore." Then she looked away, toward the hills, as if the answer to everything was hiding somewhere in that tree line, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Her name was Opal. She was born in a hollow so small it did not appear on most maps, in a house with no electricity, no plumbing, and certainly no refrigerator. The world she grew up in ran on a different kind of intelligence, one that modern people have almost completely forgotten how to access. It was an intelligence of smell, of touch, of timing, passed from mother to daughter the way other families pass down jewelry or land. Opal was the last living link to that intelligence, and she knew it. She carried it the way some people carry grief, quietly, every single day, waiting for someone to ask the right question before it disappeared forever. To understand why she said what she said, you have to understand what food actually meant before the machines came. There was no hum in the kitchen back then, no constant electrical heartbeat keeping everything cold and safe and uniform. There was only judgment. There was only memory. A mother would press her thumb into a side of bacon and know, simply know, whether the salt had done its work. A grandmother would lift the cloth off a crock of pickles and breathe in once. And that single breath would tell her everything she needed to know about whether the brine was alive or dying. This was not folklore. This was survival, refined over generations into something that looked from the outside almost like magic. Opal's earliest memory was the spring house. It sat low against the hillside behind her family's home, built directly over a cold spring that never stopped running, even in the driest part of August. She remembered the smell of wet stone and the particular chill that lived inside that small, dark room. A chill completely unlike the chill of any modern refrigerator. It was a living cold, she said, not a manufactured one. Milk kept there did not simply stay cold. It changed slowly the way a person changes, developing layers of flavor across hours instead of staying frozen in a single artificial moment. Butter pulled from that spring water in the morning tasted nothing like butter pulled from it by afternoon. Opal remembered this distinction the way other people remember the sound of a parent's voice. Then there was the smokehouse, a small wooden structure that her father tended like a second child. Hams hung there for months, sometimes longer, surrounded by smoke that came from specific woods chosen for specific reasons nobody bothered to write down, because everyone simply knew. Hickory for this, applewood for that. The smoke was not just flavor, Opal explained. It was protection. It was time itself being folded into the meat, layer after layer, until what came out the other end was something almost unrecognizable from where it started. She said modern bacon, the kind from plastic packages and bright refrigerated aisles, tastes like a rumor of what bacon used to be. A copy of a copy of a copy. What made Opal's story so quietly devastating was not just what she remembered, but what she watched disappear in real time, within a single human lifetime. She was a teenager when the first refrigerator arrived in her hollow, delivered on the back of a truck to a neighboring family who were considered, almost overnight, wealthy beyond imagination. People walked for miles just to look at it. Opal remembered standing in that neighbor's kitchen, staring at the white metal box humming quietly in the corner, and feeling something she could not name at the time. It was not excitement. It was something closer to dread, though she would not understand why for another 60 years. The refrigerator did not just preserve food differently. It changed the entire relationship between people and time. Before, food preservation was an act of devotion, requiring presence, attention, and an intimacy with decay that modern people have almost entirely lost. You had to know exactly when to harvest, exactly when to salt, exactly when the fermentation had reached its peak before turning. Every jar of preserved vegetables, every crock of sauerkraut, every coil of dried apples threaded on string above the hearth represented hundreds of small decisions made by human senses alone. The refrigerator removed the need for that intimacy. It replaced judgment with convenience. And convenience, Opal said, always comes at a cost that nobody notices until decades later, when the people who remember the old way are almost all gone. By the time Opal was an old woman, the world around her had transformed so completely that the food of her childhood existed only in her own mind, like a museum with no other visitors. The wild greens her mother used to gather along the creek bank had been replaced by uniform vegetables grown for shelf life rather than flavor. The cured meats that once took months to develop their depth were replaced by products designed to be consumed within days. Even the apples were different, Opal insisted. The varieties she grew up eating, often gnarled, oddly shaped, intensely flavored, had been abandoned in favor of apples bred for appearance and durability during shipping. She said modern apples look perfect and taste like almost nothing at all, a strange inversion of everything food used to represent. There was a particular dish Opal mentioned only once during the entire filming, almost in passing, and then refused to elaborate on for nearly 2 hours. The filmmaker noticed this immediately. It became the quiet mystery running underneath the entire documentary, the kind of unanswered thread that makes a viewer lean forward without realizing why. Opal had called it simply, the dish her grandmother made the week someone died. She would not explain what was in it. She would not explain why it mattered. She only said that it could not be made anymore, not because the ingredients were impossible to find, but because the world that gave that dish its meaning no longer existed. As the conversation continued, it became clear that food for Opal's generation was never just about taste. It was about memory encoded into flavor, grief processed through the hands, love expressed through hours of labor that no one ever spoke about directly. The dish made the week someone died was not a recipe. It was a ritual, performed in near silence, using ingredients gathered specifically because of what they represented rather than how they tasted. Opal explained slowly that her grandmother used to say flavor lives in patience, and patience cannot be bought, manufactured, or rushed. It can only be given, the way time is given, the way attention is given to something that matters. The filmmaker began to realize that Opal was not simply describing old cooking methods. She was describing a way of being human that had quietly vanished, replaced by speed, convenience, and uniformity. The community that once depended on shared smokehouses, shared springhouses, and shared knowledge of preservation had dissolved into isolated households with identical refrigerators humming behind closed doors. Where neighbors once gathered to help with a hog killing, sharing the labor and the meat afterward, families now drove separately to grocery stores filled with food that had no story attached to it at all. Opal said this without anger. She said it with something closer to mourning, the kind reserved for a person rather than a way of life. There was a long pause in the filming when Opal was asked directly why nothing tasted the same to her anymore. She looked at her hands for a long time before answering. She said that taste was never really about the tongue. It was about context, about the specific combination of hunger, labor, weather, and human connection that surrounded each meal. A tomato eaten warm from a garden you had weeded yourself, on a day you had spent in physical labor beside people you loved, simply could not taste the same as a tomato picked unripe, shipped thousands of miles, and eaten alone in a quiet kitchen lit by refrigerator light. The chemistry might be similar. The experience was nothing alike. And experience, she said, is the larger half of flavor that modern people have forgotten to measure. As the documentary crew spent more time with Opal, they began to understand the deeper mystery surrounding her. She was not simply an elderly woman with old memories. She was, in a very real sense, the final witness to an entire sensory civilization. Anthropologists who later reviewed the footage noted that traditional preservation knowledge of this kind, oral, intuitive, deeply localized, often dies with the last person who learned it directly through lived experience rather than written instruction. Opal had no written recipes. Her grandmother had none either. Everything had been passed down through demonstration, through smell, through the simple act of standing beside someone while they worked. Once Opal was gone, there would be no one left who had learned it that way.